Welcome to my YouTube channel. Hit the like button, share your thoughts, subscribe and tap the bell icon. The rain pelted the empty street, washing away the day's sins, but it couldn't cleanse what was about to happen. A woman, her hands bound behind her back, stood trembling against a wooden pole. Her clothes were soaked, clinging to her shivering frame. The wind howled through the narrow alley, carrying the distant hum of a city that had no idea what was happening in its darkest corners. The 5 men in uniform surrounded her, their laughter echoing through the empty square. Their badges gleamed under the flickering streetlight, distorted by the raindrops sliding down their polished metal. "This one's got fire in her," one of them muttered, stepping forward. He was taller than the rest, broad-shouldered, and his uniform stretched against his swollen chest as he reached out, gripping her chin roughly. She didn't flinch. "You're not even going to beg," he sneered. Silence. She held his gaze, her dark eyes unreadable. A gust of wind sent her soaked hair whipping across her face, but she made no effort to shake it away. She stood still, like a statue. The officer's smirk faltered. The fun of the game was in watching the weak crumble. He had seen men, twice her size, break under the weight of fear. But she? She was still standing. "Maybe she doesn't understand," another officer said, nudging his friend. "Maybe she's too stupid to realize what's about to happen." He leaned in closer, his breath reeking of alcohol. "You think your silence makes you brave?" He grabbed the front of her shirt and yanked her forward. "We'll see how brave you are when the night is over." Still, no reaction. The others chuckled, their laughter weaving through the pattering rain. "This is boring," one of them sighed. "I thought she'd at least cry." "She will," the tall officer replied, stepping back. "They always do." The woman lowered her head slightly, her lips parting as if she was about to speak. The men leaned in instinctively, waiting for her first sign of weakness. But what came from her lips wasn't a plea. It was a name. A single word. Soft, yet laced with something dangerous. The effect was immediate. The laughter stopped. The smirks disappeared. The air thickened, heavy with unspoken fear. One of the officers took a step back. "What? What did you say?" She raised her head. The shadows carved sharp lines across her face, making her look almost ghostly. But her eyes? They burned. "You heard me." The tall officer's jaw clenched. "That name means nothing here." The woman tilted her head slightly, almost amused. "Then why do you look afraid?" Silence. The rain grew heavier, pounding against the cobblestone, masking the quickened breaths of the men who had, only moments ago, felt invincible. They had made a mistake. A grave mistake. And now, there was no way out. Hours earlier. The village was quiet when the men arrived. It wasn't unusual for them to make unannounced visits. They carried the weight of power on their shoulders, and with that power came the privilege of taking whatever they wanted. That night, they wanted entertainment. And she was unfortunate enough to be in their path. She had been walking home, a basket of groceries tucked under her arm. The narrow streets were mostly empty, save for a few stray dogs huddling under wooden stalls. The marketplace had closed early that night. The rain was coming. She didn't notice the men at first. Not until she heard the footsteps. Slow. Measured. Predatory. She quickened her pace. Too late. A rough hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her backward. The groceries scattered across the wet ground, rolling into the gutter. Well, a voice drawled. "Where do you think you're going in such a hurry?" She turned to face them, her expression calm despite the cold hand of fear creeping up her spine. 5 men. Uniformed. Smiling. "Let go." The tallest of them chuckled. "Oh, she speaks." The others laughed, closing in. We were just looking for some fun, another said, reaching for her other wrist. She jerked away. I said, let go. The tall officer's smile faded. He didn't like resistance. You have a sharp tongue, he muttered, gripping her arm tighter. Let's see how long that lasts. Before she could react, the butt of his gun connected with the side of her head. Darkness swallowed her. The awakening her wrists burned. The rough rope cut into her skin, each movement sending sharp pain shooting through her arms. She blinked against the rain, her vision swimming. The pole. The men. The laughter. Memory rushed back like a tidal wave. They had brought her here. Tied her up like an animal. For fun. She forced her breathing to steady. Panic wouldn't help. Fear wouldn't help. They wanted a victim. She refused to give them one. She straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. If she was going to get out of this, she needed to be smart. She needed to buy time. That's when she spoke his name. The name that changed everything. Present moment the officers were still frozen in place, the woman's words ringing in their ears. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. You're lying, one of them spat, his voice lacking the confidence he had moments ago. The woman didn't reply. She didn't need to. The wind howled, rattling the loose shutters of nearby buildings. The streets were empty, but suddenly, the men felt like they were being watched. Untie her, one of them muttered. The others turned to him in shock. Are you insane? You heard the name. If she's telling the truth, he didn't finish his sentence. He didn't have to. They all knew what it meant. The tall officer clenched his fists. He had been in control. He had been the predator. But now, he felt the tables turning. If this woman really was his wife, they were in trouble. Deep trouble. We can't let her go, another whispered. If she tells him what we did, she won't get the chance, the tall officer interrupted, his voice sharp. The woman watched them, her expression unreadable. She could see the war waging in their eyes. The fear creeping into their bones. Good. Let them fear. The men exchanged glances. The rain poured harder, drowning out the sound of their breathing. Then, a distant sound. A motorcycle engine, roaring through the silence. The woman smiled. It was time. The low, guttural growl of the motorcycle engine sliced through the rain-soaked silence. It wasn't just any engine, it was one that carried a promise of reckoning. The woman, bound against the wooden pole, smiled. Not a smile of relief, nor one of desperation. It was something colder, something that sent a chill through the 5 uniformed men standing before her. Who the hell is that? One of them whispered, his eyes darting toward the street's far end. The others turned, watching the headlights carve through the night like twin daggers. The rumble grew louder, the vibrations crawling up their boots as the unseen rider approached. The tall officer clenched his fists, his pulse hammering in his throat. No. It couldn't be. There was no way. And yet, she had spoken that name. And now, here was the sound of something coming for them. Something inevitable. A deadly reputation. The tall officer, his name was Inspector Ghazi, had been in law enforcement for over a decade. He had seen hardened criminals, drug lords, and warlords alike. He had taken bribes, covered up crimes, and buried secrets that would make even the most ruthless men shudder. But there was one name he had never dared cross. And now, that name had emerged from the lips of the woman he had tied to the pole like an amusement for the night. A foolish mistake. A grave mistake. His men stood frozen, uncertain. The motorcycle roared closer, its sound like a predator approaching its prey. What do we do? One of the younger officers gripped his gun. His voice shook slightly. Inspector Ghazi exhaled slowly. He couldn't show weakness. Not now. Hold your ground. He ordered. We don't even know if it's him. And yet, deep inside, he knew. It had to be him. Because who else would come roaring into the night at the exact moment they were realizing their mistake? Her husband. A husband unlike any other. The woman, drenched from the rain, remained still against the pole. She wasn't struggling. She didn't need to. Her hands might have been bound, but she had already won. She had spoken the name once, and that was all it had taken. Now, she waited. Watched. Because she knew exactly what was coming next. The officer closest to her suddenly turned, his voice rising. Who the hell is your husband? She tilted her head, the dim streetlight casting eerie shadows over her face. The same face they had thought belonged to just another helpless villager. You'll know soon enough, she murmured. The headlights pierced through the downpour, and for the first time, they saw him. A man, dressed in black, sat atop a sleek, monstrous motorcycle. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't rushing. He was approaching them with purpose. Every movement calculated. The rain dripped off his leather gloves as he brought the bike to a slow, deliberate stop just feet away from where the woman stood bound. The officers felt it then. Something was wrong. The air had shifted. The power had changed hands. They had thought they were the predators. Now, they realized they were the prey. The man who wasn't supposed to exist. Inspector Ghazi swallowed hard, his grip tightening around his pistol. He had only heard rumors about this man. A ghost. A shadow that only appeared when it was too late. A name whispered in hushed tones among men who considered themselves untouchable, until they weren't. This wasn't just a husband. This was a reaper. And they had just given him a reason to collect. The moment everything changed, the rider swung his leg off the bike and removed his helmet, revealing sharp, angular features. His eyes locked onto the woman first. She nodded. No words were exchanged. None were needed. Then, slowly, his gaze lifted to the 5 officers. The rain beat down harder, but no one moved. Who? One officer stammered. Who the hell are you? The man's expression didn't change. But his silence was louder than any thunderclap. The woman exhaled softly, tilting her head toward the officers. This, she said, her voice dripping with quiet satisfaction, is the part where you start begging. And then. The rain thundered against the pavement as the 5 officers stood frozen, their uniforms soaked, their hands hovering near their holsters. The night had shifted. Moments ago, they had been laughing, taunting, and playing a cruel game with the woman bound to the wooden pole. Now, they were staring at death itself. The man, the one whose name she had uttered like a whispered curse, stood before them, still as stone. His black leather jacket dripped with rain, his gloves slick with water. His eyes, sharp and piercing, surveyed each man in front of him with cold calculation. No fear. No hesitation. Just the eerie stillness of a predator assessing his prey. The tall officer, Inspector Ghazi, finally spoke, his voice strained. You think you can just show up and scare us? He took a step forward, his boots splashing in a puddle. We are the law here. The man remained silent. The woman, still bound, let out a soft, amused breath. They still didn't understand. They thought the law could protect them. But law had never saved men from him before. The officer closest to Ghazi, a younger recruit named Haris, swallowed hard and leaned closer. Sir. I think I know who he is. Ghazi shot him a glare. Then say it. Haris hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. His name is Rehan Malik. Ghazi's stomach dropped. Because now he knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they were dead men standing. A name that meant death. Rehan Malik. The ghost in the shadows. The nightmare of men who thought they were untouchable. Years ago, when corruption ran rampant in the underworld, there was a man who didn't play by the rules. He didn't bribe. He didn't bow. He didn't beg. He erased. Effortlessly. No one ever knew how or when he would strike. By the time his name was spoken, it was already too late. And now, that same name had emerged from the mouth of a bound woman who should have been powerless. But she wasn't powerless. She had never been powerless. Because she belonged to him. The moment it all began, Rayhan tilted his head slightly, observing Ghazi. His lips curled, not into a smirk, but something far more chilling. Recognition. You, he said softly. Ghazi stiffened. The word wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. You remember me, don't you? Rayhan asked. Ghazi's fingers twitched toward his gun, but he hesitated. That hesitation would cost him. Do you remember 10 years ago? Rayhan continued, stepping forward. Slow. Deliberate. A little town. A family who refused to pay your protection fee. Ghazi's chest tightened. No, he whispered. That was, a husband, Rayhan cut in. A wife. A daughter. His voice remained calm, but the weight behind it was lethal. You took the father away. Put a bullet in his head in front of his wife. Silence. The younger officers turned pale. They hadn't known this. Ghazi's hands clenched. That was a long time ago. Rayhan's expression didn't change. For you, maybe, he said. For them? It never ended. The woman on the pole exhaled softly. Because she, too, knew the story. The gun that wouldn't save him, Ghazi snapped. His hand flew to his holster, yanking his gun free. Enough of this, he snarled. You think you can walk in here and, bang. His words were cut off, not by a bullet, but by the sharp, deafening crack of Rayhan's fist colliding with his jaw. Ghazi hit the ground hard, his gun slipping from his fingers. Blood pooled in his mouth as he gasped, dazed from the sudden blow. He had never even seen Rayhan move. The other officers stumbled back. What the hell? Before they could react, Rayhan lunged. A second officer barely had time to raise his hands before Rayhan's elbow crashed into his ribs, sending him sprawling. Another reached for his weapon, but Rayhan grabbed his wrist, twisted, and snapped it with a sickening crack. Screams echoed in the rain. The fourth officer, Haris, stood frozen, paralyzed by fear. Rayhan turned to him next. Unblinking. Haris dropped his gun. I didn't touch her, he stammered. I swear. Rayhan didn't care. He reached forward, grabbed Haris by the collar, and slammed him into the nearest wall. You stood by and watched, Rayhan said, his voice ice cold. Haris couldn't breathe. Men like you, Rayhan continued, tightening his grip, are worse than the ones who pull the trigger. Haris sobbed. Rayhan finally let go, letting the young officer crumple to the ground in a shaking mess. The only one left standing was Ghazi. Rayhan turned back to him, his eyes like fire. Ghazi coughed, spitting blood onto the pavement. You think this changes anything? He rasped. You're just a thug. Rayhan stepped closer. The woman, still bound to the pole, spoke then. Her voice was quiet, but sharp as a knife. Rayhan. He turned. She tilted her head toward the ropes. He moved immediately, pulling out a small blade and slicing through the wet knots with ease. The ropes fell away, and she slumped forward. But before she could fall, Rayhan caught her. Their eyes met. And for the first time that night, his gaze softened. She reached up, fingers brushing his cheek. You came, she whispered. Rayhan's lips pressed together. Always. Then, he turned back to Ghazi. The softness disappeared. The predator returned. You tied my wife to a pole, Rayhan said, his voice like steel. Ghazi tried to get to his feet, but Rayhan stepped on his chest, pinning him down. You wanted to play with her, Rayhan continued, pressing harder. Ghazi gasped, choking on the weight. Now, Rayhan said, I play with you. The night wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. The weight of Rayhan's boot pressed deeper into Inspector Ghazi's chest, suffocating him in the cold, merciless rain. Ghazi gasped for breath, his vision blurring as he fought to push the crushing pressure off. But no matter how hard he struggled, the predator didn't budge. Rayhan's face remained unreadable. The tension in the air crackled like an electric charge, each second stretching, each movement calculated. Ghazi knew this was the end. The mistakes of his past were catching up, and the shadows he had tried to bury were rising from the grave. He had taken lives. Destroyed families. Ruined futures. And now, those lives, those souls, were standing before him, embodied in the person of Rayhan Malik. A man of honor. Rayhan stood above Ghazi, his expression sharp and focused. He didn't say a word, there was no need for threats or accusations. The truth was already too clear. Rayhan, please, Ghazi wheezed, his words trembling. You don't know what you're doing. Rayhan's eyes narrowed. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing, he replied coolly. You're going to pay for what you've done. Just like your friends. Ghazi's mind raced. He had to get out. He couldn't die here, not like this. He reached for his gun, desperate, shaking, but before he could even touch it, Rayhan's hand was on his wrist, twisting it with force that sent shockwaves through his body. The gun dropped to the ground with a clatter. Please, Ghazi gasped again, his voice strained. I know what you did to the Malik family, Rayhan interrupted, his voice cold as ice. The father, my mentor, he died because of you. Ghazi's throat tightened. He didn't want to hear this. No, Ghazi muttered. You don't know, I know exactly what happened, Rayhan said. He crouched down, his eyes locking with Ghazi's. You and your men killed a good man. Took him away from his wife and daughter. I've never forgotten that night. Ghazi's breath quickened as the memories of that night began to surface. The terror, the pain, the regret. The family they destroyed. It had been 10 years ago. The town was a quiet one, nestled in the rolling hills where nothing much ever happened. It was a place where people went about their lives without fear of the law, assuming that those who swore to protect them would always be there. But that night, everything had changed. Ghazi had been a different man then, a younger officer, hungry for power. His ambition outstripped his sense of justice. And in his quest to climb the ranks, he made a deal with some of the worst criminals in the area. It started with a small extortion scheme, a protection racket. The Malik family had refused to pay the fee that Ghazi's men demanded. The patriarch of the family, a man named Javed Malik, had been a respected figure in the community. A man of integrity. He stood up for what was right, even when it cost him everything. But that night, Ghazi had walked into the Malik household with his men, and they had made an example of Javed. They'd dragged him outside, tied him to a post, and put a bullet in his head. His wife, Syra, had screamed. Their daughter, Amina, had been only 10 years old. She watched her father die right before her eyes. The fallout. Rayhan hadn't been there that night. He had been out of town, unaware of what had happened. But when he returned, everything had already been destroyed. He found his mentor's body, his blood staining the earth, his wife sobbing uncontrollably. He held her in his arms as she cried, promising her that Ghazi and his men would pay for what they had done. Rayhan had spent the years since tracking Ghazi's every move, waiting for the right moment. And now, finally, that moment had arrived. The unspoken truth. As Rayhan recounted the past, Ghazi felt his heart sink deeper into the pit of despair. He had made a deal with the devil, and now the devil had come to collect. "You took everything from me," Rayhan said, his voice a whisper, yet it carried the weight of years of pain. "My mentor. My family. My future." Ghazi struggled to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He knew he couldn't undo the past. "You were a part of my family," Rayhan continued. "I made a promise to Javed that I would protect his wife and daughter. And now, I'm here to make sure his legacy lives on." At that moment, Ghazi understood. This wasn't just about vengeance. This was about something much deeper. This was about honor. And it was about justice. The unexpected twist. Just as Rayhan was about to move, there was a loud noise in the distance, a vehicle screeching to a halt. The officers, still standing at the edge of the scene, looked up in confusion. The woman, Saira Malik, moved forward, stepping past Rayhan. She walked calmly toward Ghazi, her eyes narrowed. The officers flinched. They hadn't seen her move. "I thought this was between you and him," Ghazi managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Saira's gaze softened for a moment as she looked down at the man who had taken everything from her. "It is," she said, her voice steady. "But some things need to be heard directly from the source." She stepped closer, and the officers watched in stunned silence. "You don't understand, do you, Ghazi?" Saira asked. "You thought you could take everything from us and walk away without consequences. You thought you could destroy my husband's life, and mine, and nothing would ever come back to haunt you." Ghazi couldn't speak. His throat was dry, his hands trembling. But Saira wasn't done. She knelt beside him, her eyes locking with his in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. "No one walks away from the damage they cause," she said quietly. "Not even you." The air was thick with tension as Saira stood over Ghazi, her gaze unwavering, her expression colder than the rain-soaked street beneath them. The truth hung in the air like smoke, dense, suffocating, and undeniable. Ghazi had tried to escape the consequences of his actions, but there was no escape from the woman standing before him. Rayhan watched silently, his arms folded across his chest, his eyes fixed on Ghazi with an intensity that spoke of years of anger and sorrow. The officers behind him remained motionless, unsure of what to do, caught in a web of fear and confusion. They had never seen their superior, the man who had instilled fear in everyone around him, so vulnerable. But now, as Ghazi lay there, choking on his own guilt, they realized that no amount of power could shield him from what was about to unfold. The shattered mirror of the past. Saira took a step forward, her boots clicking sharply against the wet pavement. She bent down slowly, bringing herself eye level with Ghazi, who was still gasping for breath. "Do you remember her?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the relentless rain. "My daughter. Amina." Ghazi's eyes flickered with recognition, though he refused to speak. The name hung in the air, a final nail in the coffin of his own moral decay. Amina. The child he had witnessed suffer. The girl whose life had been shattered, whose innocence had been stolen by the officers he had commanded. Saira leaned closer, her lips curling into a grim smile. "You remember her, don't you? That little girl who stood there, crying for her father. You thought you could erase her, just like you erased her mother's happiness." Ghazi's face paled. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He had been the one to order her father's execution, but the weight of the child's screams, those haunting cries, had stayed with him, clawing at his conscience. "You thought it would be easy, didn't you?" Saira continued, her words cutting through the cold air. "You thought you could break us. Take everything we had and walk away, untouched. But you didn't know who you were dealing with." Ghazi swallowed hard, his mind racing. He had underestimated her, both of them. What he thought was a routine execution had now become a twisted nightmare that wouldn't let him wake up. Rayhan's silent vengeance. As Syra spoke, Rayhan remained in the background, the embodiment of quiet fury. He didn't need to say much. He didn't need to make a spectacle of the revenge that had been years in the making. Everything he had done, every move he had made since that night, had led to this moment. Rayhan had seen firsthand the kind of destruction men like Ghazi were capable of. But what hurt him the most wasn't the loss of Javed Malik, it was the knowledge that Syra had suffered alone for so long. That his mentor's death had left a hole in her heart that no one could fill. He had promised her, vowed, to bring justice. And he had kept that promise. But as Rayhan stood there, his eyes never leaving Ghazi's trembling form, something shifted in him. There was no joy in this moment. No satisfaction. There was only a sense of duty fulfilled, and the heavy burden of what had to be done. The daughter who had never forgotten Syra turned away from Ghazi, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. The rain blurred her vision, but she wasn't looking at the world around her, she was looking inward. The daughter she had lost, the man she had loved, and the life she had once known felt like distant memories. But Amina, her daughter, had been the thread that held her together. Amina, Syra whispered to herself, her voice almost lost in the storm. She's the reason I'm still standing. The reason I'm still breathing. Rayhan's eyes softened as he approached her, his voice low. She's not the only reason you're here, Syra. You fought for this moment. You fought for your family. For Javed. She looked at him, her eyes clearer now, no longer clouded by anger. I know, she said softly, her hand brushing against his arm. But there are some things that can never be erased, Rayhan. Some scars stay forever. He nodded, understanding. He, too, carried scars that would never heal. Do you remember what Javed used to say? Rayhan asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. When the storm comes, you don't run from it. You stand and face it. Syra's lips curved into a sad smile. He was always the strong one. And you, Rayhan added, you've become even stronger. Syra glanced back at the officers standing in the rain, the men who had once enforced their twisted sense of power. Now, they were nothing more than shadows, weakened by the weight of their choices. Ghazi was broken, reduced to nothing more than a man begging for mercy he did not deserve. The final judgment. Syra took a long breath and turned her attention back to Ghazi, who was still lying on the ground, trembling. His face was a twisted mask of regret and fear, but there was no remorse. Not yet. You still don't understand, do you? She asked, her voice steady, yet laced with bitterness. You're nothing but a coward, Ghazi. Hiding behind a badge. Hiding behind the law. You thought you were untouchable, but you were just a man who was too weak to face the consequences of his actions. Ghazi shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to, but you did, Syra interrupted sharply. You meant it, Ghazi. Every second of it. And you will pay. Rayhan stepped forward, placing his hand on her shoulder. He didn't need to say anything. Syra had already made her choice. They had both made it. Ghazi wasn't going to walk away from this. There was no more mercy left for him. The storm that had come for him wasn't one that could be avoided. I want you to understand one thing, Ghazi, Syra said, her voice low but filled with authority. You killed him. And now, I'm going to make sure you understand the weight of that. Every step you take from here on out will be a reminder of that night. And you'll carry it until your last breath. The final choice. The officers around them stood in stunned silence, their faces pale. They had all witnessed the power that Rayhan and Syra wielded, the force of justice that was now in motion. As the rain continued to pour, Rayhan and Syra made their way toward the motorcycle. They were done here. The man who had destroyed their lives was no longer their concern. He had made his choices. Now, he would live with them. And as they disappeared into the night, a single truth remained clear. There was no escape from the consequences of one's actions. The storm had come, and it had claimed its victims. The storm had not relented. The rain pounded relentlessly against the earth, as if the heavens themselves had joined the chorus of judgment. Rayhan and Syra rode through the streets, the roar of the motorcycle drowning out the thoughts that swirled in both of their minds. Yet, despite the noise, a profound silence hung between them. Neither spoke, for words had become meaningless after what they had done. Rayhan's hands gripped the handlebars, but his mind was far away, haunted by the faces of the people he had lost, the promises he had made, and the price of vengeance. Syra, too, was lost in thought. Her heart was heavy, not with sorrow, but with the weight of justice finally being served. Yet, there was no victory in her eyes. There was only the quiet resolve of a woman who had endured the unimaginable and fought with everything she had left to reclaim what was stolen from her. But as they neared their destination, the truth began to settle in. The night was far from over, and the story was far from finished. The return of Amina. As they approached an old, run-down building at the outskirts of town, the motorcycle came to a stop. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and the once vibrant neon lights that lined the building's exterior flickered weakly in the storm. This place, a forgotten relic of the past, was where it all began, and where it would end. Rayhan cut the engine and swung off the bike, his boots splashing through the puddles as he moved toward the entrance. Syra followed close behind, her expression hard, her every step deliberate. But before they could even reach the door, a shadow appeared in the doorway, a figure they both recognized instantly. It was Amina. The lost daughter returns. Amina's face had changed. It had to. Years of grief, loss, and betrayal had sculpted her into a woman unlike the child she had been that fateful night. Her once soft features had hardened, her eyes now filled with a cold, calculating wisdom. She had become someone who understood pain, and understood how to make it stop. Her eyes met Syra's first, those eyes that once mirrored her own, now filled with something darker. Amina, Syra breathed, her voice trembling for the first time in years. I didn't think you'd come back. Amina's lips curved into a sad, knowing smile. I didn't think I would either, she replied, stepping into the rain-soaked night. But things change. Syra opened her arms, and Amina stepped forward into them. They embraced, but it wasn't the reunion they had imagined. It was a reunion shaped by years of separation, trauma, and loss, yet, it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Syra allowed herself to feel the relief of seeing her daughter again. Amina's journey. The storm raged on as Amina pulled away from her mother's embrace. Her eyes lingered on the spot where Ghazi had once lay, broken and pleading. She had seen everything. Did he beg for mercy? Amina asked softly, her voice devoid of emotion. Syra nodded once. He did. Amina's eyes hardened. Good. She stepped forward and glanced at Rayhan, who stood silently by. It's over now, right? Rayhan hesitated before nodding. It's over. But even as he spoke those words, he knew that something else was at play here. The real battle wasn't just about bringing Ghazi down, it was about mending the fractured souls of those who had been torn apart by the past. And that was something that no amount of vengeance could ever heal. The final truth about Amina. For years, Amina had lived in the shadows of her parents' grief, unable to escape the pain of the night her father was taken from her. After Ghazi's men had killed Javed, she had been sent away. Hidden from the world by Syra, who had kept her safe in the hope that one day, the pieces of their shattered lives might be put back together. But the world had changed. Amina had changed. She had grown into a woman who understood the language of pain, and the language of power. I've been following the trail, Mother, Amina said, her voice suddenly sharp. I knew Rayhan would come for them. I knew he'd come for you. Cyrus' eyes widened in shock. You knew? Amina nodded, her expression unreadable. You think I stayed hidden for all these years because I was scared? She laughed softly, but there was no humor in her voice. I stayed hidden because I needed to be. Because there was more to this story than just revenge. Rayhan's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Amina turned to him, her gaze piercing. You think this ends with Ghazi? She asked. You think his death will fix anything? The words hit like a thunderclap. Rayhan didn't speak, but the gravity of her statement sank in. There was something she wasn't telling them. The unseen threat. Amina stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. The real enemy hasn't been Ghazi. He was just a puppet. The one pulling the strings all along, the one who controls everything, is still out there. Cyrus' heart skipped a beat. Who? Amina's lips pressed together, her jaw clenched with resolve. The man behind Ghazi's rise to power. The one who gave him the orders. The one who has been orchestrating this from the start. Rayhan's eyes darkened. Who is it, Amina? Amina paused, as if weighing the enormity of what she was about to reveal. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the name that would send shockwaves through their very souls. Rashid Malik. The name hit Syra and Rayhan like a bolt of lightning. Rashid Malik. The name of a man who was supposed to be long gone, a ghost from the past. But now, he was back. The true enemy revealed. Rashid Malik had been Javed's brother, Amina's uncle. And for years, he had disappeared without a trace, leaving a void in the Malik family that no one had ever been able to fill. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together, the horrifying truth began to sink in. Rashid had been the mastermind behind it all. The one who had pushed Ghazi into making the decisions that led to the deaths of countless innocent lives. The one who had manipulated them all, pulling the strings from the shadows. And now, it was time to confront him. The revelation hit like a tidal wave, overwhelming them with a sense of dread that was impossible to shake. Rashid Malik, Amina's uncle, the man who had been lost to time, had never truly disappeared. He had merely been biding his time, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The silence that followed Amina's revelation hung heavy in the air, broken only by the steady beat of the rain. Rayhan, Syra, and Amina stood still, each of them processing the gravity of what had just been revealed. Rashid Malik. The name was a ghost. A specter that had haunted their family for years. And now, it had returned to claim the lives of those who had wronged it. The man behind the mask. Amina's voice was low but steady as she spoke again. Rashid was never the quiet, innocent man they all believed he was. He was always pulling the strings, manipulating Ghazi and anyone who came near him. The truth is, he wanted everything, the power, the control. Cyrus' eyes narrowed as she absorbed her daughter's words. Rashid had always been the black sheep of the family, the one who kept to the shadows. But they had thought him dead, gone without a trace. They were wrong. How did you find out? Rayhan asked, his voice rough with disbelief. How could you know he was still alive? Amina paused for a moment before answering. I had my ways, she said, her lips curling into a small smile. You don't grow up in a family like ours and not learn a few tricks. Rashid was hiding in plain sight, manipulating things from behind the scenes. He used Ghazi as his pawn, just as he had used many others before. Rayhan looked over at Syra, his mind racing. They had thought they were done, that they had rid themselves of the poison that had ruined their lives. But now, they had to confront something much bigger than they could have imagined. Where is he? Syra asked, her voice strained. Where is Rashid now? Amina's gaze hardened. I've tracked him down. He's not far from here. He's set up his new operation in a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I've been watching him, but I didn't want to go in alone. Then we go together, Rayhan said firmly. It's time to finish this. The final confrontation. The trio made their way back to the motorcycle, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they were about to face. The journey felt surreal, each mile bringing them closer to the ghost they had hoped to leave behind. The storm had not ceased, and the rain seemed to match the heaviness in their hearts as they rode through the desolate streets. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. A few flickering lights from the windows gave the impression that it was still in operation, as if nothing had changed. But they knew better. Everything had changed. Rayhan cut the engine and looked over at Saira and Amina. The woman beside him was no longer just the grieving widow, she was a force, a woman who had fought for everything she had and lost it all, only to rise from the ashes. And Amina, she was no longer the frightened little girl. She had become something else, something more powerful than any of them had imagined. They moved quietly toward the entrance of the warehouse, their footsteps masked by the relentless sound of the rain. Rayhan led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings, his every sense alert. Saira followed closely, her hand instinctively resting on the blade at her side. Amina, who had become the master of silence, was the last to enter, her eyes never leaving the door as they pushed it open. The shadow in the dark inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of metal and dust. The dim light cast long shadows across the large space, and the only sounds were the distant clanging of machinery and the creaking of the building settling under the weight of years of neglect. And then, they heard it. A voice, a smooth, unsettling voice, echoed from the far corner of the room. Well, if it isn't the Maliks. They turned to see him. Rashid Malik. He was standing there, his back against the wall, his face half hidden in shadow. But the smirk on his lips was unmistakable. Rashid had not changed. He was still the same man who had sold out his own brother for the sake of power. Still the same man who had orchestrated the destruction of their family. Rashid, Saira said, her voice a mixture of anger and disbelief. We thought you were dead. Oh, I've been dead to you, Saira, Rashid replied, his voice smooth, almost comforting. But you should have known better. You should have known that someone like me never truly dies. I've always been here, watching, waiting. Amina stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. This ends tonight, Rashid. No more lies, no more manipulation. Rashid laughed, his laughter echoing through the dark space. You think you can stop me? You think any of you have the power to take me down? I've already won. Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, it's already in motion. Saira clenched her fists. Not this time. Rashid's eyes flicked to Rayhan, his gaze piercing. Ah, the famous Rayhan Malik. I see you've come to play. But it won't matter. You're just as much a pawn as everyone else. Rayhan took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. No, Rashid. You're the pawn. And the game's over. The final move. The tension in the room was palpable. The final confrontation had arrived. Rashid's smirk faded, and for the first time, something akin to fear flickered in his eyes. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the cold, calculated confidence he had always carried with him. He knew how to manipulate. He knew how to control. But now, he was the one being controlled. Make your move, Rashid said, his voice dripping with venom. But know this, you will regret it. And with that, the storm that had been building since the beginning of this war finally exploded. The final game had begun, and there was no turning back. The air inside the warehouse felt heavier now, charged with the tension of impending conflict. Rashid Malik stood in front of them, his face a mask of arrogance, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had orchestrated so much, pulling strings in the shadows, but now the light of truth was shining directly on him. And it wasn't a light he could escape from. Saira, Amina, and Rayhan stood in a tight formation, ready to confront the man who had caused so much pain. They had come here for justice, but more importantly, they had come here for peace, peace that had eluded them for years. The moment of truth. Rashid took a step forward, his smile still intact, but his voice had lost some of its edge. You think you can just walk in here and take everything from me? After all these years of planning? You're a fool if you believe that. Rayhan's eyes narrowed. The only fool here is you, Rashid. You've been hiding behind lies and manipulation for far too long. Amina stepped forward, her voice steady, filled with both resolve and pain. You didn't just take my father. You destroyed our family. And now, you'll pay for everything you've done. Rashid's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but then he regained control. You're just a little girl playing a part in a game you don't understand. You can't stop me. You think you know what power is, but you have no idea what it truly means. Saira's voice was low, steady with anger and sorrow. You're wrong, Rashid. We know what power is. It's not about control or fear. It's about standing up for what's right, even when the world tries to crush you. And you've crushed enough people for one lifetime. The battle of wills. Rashid's expression darkened. You don't get it, do you? You've never understood that the world isn't kind to those who refuse to play the game. You refuse to bend, you refuse to compromise. And you wonder why you've lost everything. He stepped forward again, his voice rising in fury. I didn't lose anything. I gained everything. Power. Control. The world bows to me now. I've built an empire while you've been hiding in the shadows. Rayhan stepped in front of Saira and Amina, his posture firm, his voice unshakable. You built nothing. You used people. You tore families apart for your own gain. And now, your empire will crumble. Rashid laughed bitterly, but there was no humor in it. Crumbles? You think I fear you, Rayhan? You're nothing but a man seeking redemption for things you can never undo. You're not a hero. You're just another fool who believes in justice. Saira's eyes glinted with fury. And you, Rashid, are nothing more than a coward hiding behind your lies. The final confrontation. Without warning, Rashid pulled out a gun, aiming it directly at Rayhan. The movement was swift, calculated, but the tension in the air had already made the scene feel like a slow-motion battle. Time seemed to stretch as everyone held their breath. You think this ends with words? With speeches? Rashid spat. I don't play by your rules. Before anyone could react, Amina lunged, knocking Rashid's arm to the side just as he pulled the trigger. The bullet flew past Rayhan, embedding itself in the wall behind him. The shot echoed through the warehouse like a death knell, marking the point of no return. Rashid cursed and struggled to break free from Amina's grip, but she was stronger than he'd expected. She had been prepared for this moment for years. The years of training, the anger, the resentment, all boiled to the surface as she wrestled with him. You think you can control everything, Rashid? Amina hissed, her grip tightening. This is over. Rayhan stepped forward, his movements precise. He knew the time had come to end this once and for all. He was ready. But not without one final challenge, one final act to remove the last remnants of Rashid's control. The power of family. Saira stepped beside Amina, her gaze locked on her brother-in-law, the man who had been a stranger to her for so long. You never understood the value of family, did you, Rashid? You only used it for your gain. But family isn't about power. It's about love. Rashid's expression twisted into something unrecognizable. Love? Love didn't save you when you lost everything. Power saved you, and it will save me again. But as his words rang out, the weight of them began to feel hollow. The truth was plain. He had never truly understood what power was. Not the kind that mattered. Rayhan moved swiftly, his hands reaching out to seize the gun from Rashid's grasp. It was over. The violence, the manipulation, the decades of pain, they had all led to this moment. With a final, calculated move, Rayhan took the weapon, holding it steady. Rashid's defiance faltered, and in that moment, the power he had so desperately clung to seemed utterly meaningless. The man who had built his empire on the backs of the broken and the innocent was now a shadow of his former self. Justice served. Syra looked at her daughter, and for the first time in years, she saw a woman who was no longer the child lost in grief. Amina had become a force of nature. Together, they had confronted the monster who had ruined their lives, and they had won. Rashid stood there, broken and defeated. His empire, his lies, his power, all of it had come to nothing. He was a man out of time. And now, in the cold light of truth, there was no more place for him. "Take him away," Rayhan said, his voice steady. It was over. The final chapter had been written. Amina and Syra exchanged a long, knowing look. This was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Their lives, scarred by years of pain, would never be the same, but at least they had reclaimed their dignity. The road ahead with Rashid's fall came a quiet sense of relief, but it wasn't the kind of victory that offered immediate joy. It was the hard-won peace that only those who had lost everything could truly appreciate. Syra turned to Amina. "Are you ready?" Amina nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Ready for whatever comes next. And as they walked away from the warehouse, the storm that had once seemed so fierce began to subside, leaving behind only the scent of rain-soaked earth and the promise of a new dawn.